Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 1, Part 10, Trial by Fire, read by Natalia Buzova. At that time, the head of the school, Colonel Sadovsky, rushed about in his emochka along the hot triangle Petigorsk-Georgievsk-Nalchik. Almost a third of the personnel of the school remained in Petigorsk, which had to be taken out of the city at the last moment and evacuated to the rear. There was an order from the main directorate of the armored and mechanized forces of the Red Army. Near Georgievsk, a separate cadet battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Kanevsky fought deterrent battles with the enemy, following the order of the commander of the northern group of forces of the Transcaucasian Front, General Maslenikov. And in Nalchik, the last unsent echelon was the property of the school, and the families of the command staff stood on the railroad tracks. Until it left, the cadet barrier in Petigorsk could not be removed either. The platoon comrades and I were also part of the barrier. The real exam began for us on August the 9th. It was Sunday, sunny and hot. It was my birthday. I turned 19. A year ago, on that day, I took the oath, and now I had to fulfill my duty to the motherland. In the morning, as usual, all the divisions went to work and services. As before, they guarded the airfield, the cold storage facilities, the power plant, the station, the source of drinking water, patrolled the streets and parks. As in previous days, no orders were received to organize the defense of the city or withdraw the remaining cadets from it, and it was not supposed to ask about it in the army. For talking about evacuation and even about the defense of the city, you could be accused of defeatist sentiments, of underestimating the combat power of the Red Army, or disbelief in Stalin himself. And to talk about abandoning the city meant to be known as a coward and an alarmist, with all the ensuing consequences. Then you feared not so much of enemies as yourselves. After all, the most incredible conclusions were often made from the most innocuous situations, conversations, and actions. As soon as some loyal careerist told where it should have been reported to, they knew everything for you and decided at the top, and you had to be ready to unquestioningly carry out any order. The regulation of the behavior of each soldier and commander was so strict, it often cost the extra blood, but it was regarded as spilled for a just cause. That was encouraged, glorified, and inspired by the name of the great leader and commander, Comrade Stalin. How did the events develop on that day? By lunchtime, individual platoons began to return to their townships to eat, and their commanders, with the same purpose, dispersed to their apartments or to the canteen for the command staff, which was located in the city center. People were scurrying around the streets, emptying shops, warehouses, institutions, and perhaps no one felt the danger until machine guns fired along the central avenue and shells fired from tank guns began to burst. Panic, usual in such cases, began. The residents were hiding in their homes, and belated refugees, the last police officers, and other paramilitary services rushed headlong to the bridge across the Podkumok to jump out onto the highway leading to Nalchik. This is how the former commander of the 12th Company, Kirillov, who was then in the very center of the city, recalls those events. By 1 p.m., I came to the canteen of the command personnel, but it turned out to be closed. Then I was invited to his apartment by the junior lieutenant Verkhusha. Near the school headquarters, we saw the passenger car of the school commissar Tsiplakov. Next to him, there was his adjutant, Lieutenant Bessonov. To find out the news almost firsthand, he was invited to a friendly dinner. We came to Verkhusha's apartment. It was located on the third floor in Andrzejewski Street. From the balcony, the headquarters of the school and the central avenue were clearly visible. Verkhusha began to lay the table, and Bessonov and I talked about the latest news. Listen, Nikolai, I turned to him. You go with the authorities all the time and should know where the Germans are now. The Germans occupied Mineralные воды yesterday, Bessonov replied in such a tone as if nothing special had happened. So why don't they tell us anything about it? They don't say, so that there is no panic. Wow. At that time, explosions of shells and machine gun bursts were heard. We jumped out onto the balcony and were stunned. A German tank was moving along the avenue towards the flower garden, and behind it, firing on the move, machine gunners in gray-green uniforms, in helmets and with their sleeves rolled up, ran in a chain. It was as if we were blown down by the wind. Shouting, "My Commissar!" Bessonov rushed to the headquarters, and Verkhusha and I began to make our way to our lower town. As it turned out later, the advanced units of the 3rd Panzer Division of the Germans overturned the battle formation of the 11th NKVD Division and the Novocherkassk Cavalry School, which had been covering Pyatigorsk, and burst into the city. A short operational summary of our 9th Army for that day read: the enemy has broken into Pyatigorsk with an amphibious assault group of 8 tanks and up to 100 machine gunners in military trucks and motorcycles on August the 9th at 2 p.m., destroyed communication lines, and is conducting a street battle. The Germans seized the station and the city center on the move, fired at both military corps from 10 guns, but could not take them. Obviously, at the beginning of the operation, they did not have enough strength for that, and they limited themselves to blocking them. Despite the fact that the school was not prepared for the defense of the city and its units were scattered, from the first minute the enemy was still resisted. The resistance was local, disorganized, but bold and daring. In various places, fighting detachments and groups appeared, led by initiative and courageous commanders. The first to notice the enemy and enter into battle with it were 14 cadets from our company under the command of Sub-Lieutenant Dubovik. At the top of Mashuk Mountain, there was a VNOS aerial observation of aircraft post. There they were on duty that day. Seeing the Germans riding in trucks, they immediately slashed at them from an anti-aircraft machine gun and rifles. The fascists scattered across the thickets and ditches and then opened mortar fire and tried to take the top of the mountain. The cadets with well-aimed fire destroyed about a dozen fascists in their trucks and then fired back while there were cartridges and retreated to their company behind the Podkumok. That feat was glorified by the famous poet Marshak in the poem Ballad of 15, published in Pioneer magazine #1 in 1943. Of course, 15 is a small number, but if 15 guys are ready to fight like these heroes, they will block the enemy's path. German tanks were rushing towards Pyatigorsk. Enemy troops were thrown out when a brave handful of Komsomol members were collected by a young lieutenant. Robbers in helmets climbed the slopes to the glorious mountain Mashuk. One after another, grenades flew at them from well-aimed, confident hands. Towards vehicles with the spider sign, for an hour and a half, a bottle of fuel flew from the top, and a machine gun poured with lead. 14 brave guys fought against a landing force with a rifle, grenade, bayonet. 15 of them were there with a dashing lieutenant, 16 with Mount Mashuk. German helmets dotted the slopes, roads at the foot of Mashuk, while Caucasian troops occupied the line of defense. There were other battles with the Germans. Lieutenant Dvorak's platoon on duty in the city met a truck with the Nazis with volley fire from rifles near the commandant's office and destroyed 8 Fritzes who got off the truck. The rest of them disappeared. Bayonet Master Junior Lieutenant Plahotka with 2 cadets literally hunted for individual Nazi marauders. In the courtyard of a hospital, they killed 4 Germans and took the 5th prisoner, but could not bring him to their own battalion. When trying to escape, he had to be killed. For 2 days, the cadets of the lower town held the defense on the Podkumok River. They prevented German tanks from crossing the bridge to the highway leading to Nalchik. 1 tank was set on fire with bottles with a combustible mixture by a cadet of the 12th Company Segal, now a retired Major General. 2 tanks were knocked out with anti-tank rifles by cadets of the 9th Company Ignatyenko and Krivobok. Lieutenant German Pestov performed a special feat. He picked up 8 volunteers and put them on the Komsomolets tractor, a light wedge heel with frontal armor and a machine gun. At dawn on August the 10th, they burst into the city and swept along the central avenue from the flower garden to the station, shooting the dumbfounded Fritzes with machine guns, setting fire with bottles with the combustible mixture to the vehicles with cargo standing along the road. The Germans were alarmed and sent 2 tanks against the Russian shell. In a skirmish with them, Pestov and 5 cadets died. The rest of them crossed the river by swimming and returned to their own battalion. The street on which the brave lieutenant fell is named after him. And now I'll tell you what happened in our upper town. There were 4 companies, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th, 160 people each. That was our 4th battalion. But no more than 300 people remained in the town. The 16th Company had completely departed to the Kumsky line. From the rest, 1-2 platoons had been taken there. In addition, on August the 9th, 1 platoon of the 15th Company guarded the airfield, and 1 platoon from our company carried our garrison service in Kislovodsk. So by the time the Germans invaded, about 200 cadets remained in place. Approximately the same number of cadets remained in Lower Town. On that day, our 2nd platoon of the 13th Company of 40 people loaded topographic maps on vehicles from the warehouses of the military district. At about 1:30 p.m., we returned to the town, and as soon as we lined up to go to lunch, somewhere from behind Mashuk came an incomprehensible shooting. As it turned out later, the VNOS post met the Germans from the top of the mountain. Then came cannon shots and machine gun bursts in the station area. The Germans approached the city from the Vinsady and Lermontov patrols. It was the advance regiment of the enemy's 3rd Panzer Division, and not a landing, as stated in the operational report of the 9th Army, received from a radio operator from Petigorsk, in which she had been deliberately left behind. Lieutenant Voronov, duty officer for the town, jumped out of the battalion headquarters. He gave the command at the top of his voice, "Alarm, in action." We rushed to the barracks for rifles, which we had got hold of a little from the retreating soldiers of the 37th Army. There were 26 of them in our platoon for 40 cadets. There was also an anti-tank rifle with 7 rounds and a box of anti-infantry grenades. I did not have a rifle, since a plate from a company training mortar was attached to me. At first, the situation was unclear. Something was going on in the city. The phones didn't work. We took up defenses near the cemetery behind a stone wall. Scouts were sent in all directions, and messengers were sent to the headquarters of the school. Soon, they brought news that there were German tanks in the city. At this time, we noticed that several tanks were moving from the junction to the station. Two of them turned halfway towards our town. Then the crew of the anti-tank rifle moved forward and hid behind the stones. When the front tank approached 250 meters, it was knocked out with the second shot, and the second tank backed away and turned towards the station. We enthusiastically congratulated Sergeant Levchenko on his first victory. The tank stood motionless until nightfall, and when it got dark, the Germans removed it. The daredevils volunteered to crawl up and set fire to it with bottles with the mixture, but the lieutenant did not allow, saying that the area was open and the Nazis entrenched in tanks could open fire. They may have been waiting for it. Soon, we had clashes with submachine gunners who tried to infiltrate the town through the outskirts of the city. They were on blind repeat fire, and we hit them in a well-aimed way from hiding places. Having received a rebuff, they withdrew, carrying away the dead and wounded. Cadets of the 14th Company, headed by Junior Lieutenant Plachodko, pursued them to the Red Cross Hospital and school. There, Plachodko was wounded, and one cadet was killed. The heat was intense. Since I did not have a rifle, I became Lieutenant Voronov's liaison. I had to run with orders from one group to group without a break. My shirt was all wet with sweat, and I asked permission to remove the rolled overcoat and store it in the corner house. We then naively believed that we would destroy this landing quickly and go to the dining room for lunch. Having received the go-ahead from my temporary commander, we did not know where our platoon gava was at that time. I went into the courtyard. An elderly woman in her 70s met me on the porch. She timidly asked, "What do you want, son?" I expressed my request in a nutshell and held out the roll. She took it in her outstretched arms, pressed it to her chest, and sobbed. I was confused without knowing what to do, but there was no time to comfort her, and I, having uttered something soothing, ran out of the yard. I will remember that woman for the rest of my life. She's very similar to today's Belarusian film actress Danuta. I could describe to the smallest detail her questioning face, mournful eyes, and swollen veins on her hands. Either her son or grandson was somewhere in the war, or she deeply felt the approach of the mortal danger that threatened her peaceful family hearth. I did not have to return to that house, although at night I was again near it. I don't know how long my cadet's overcoat was kept in it. I want to believe that the family tradition about it is still alive. After that, Lieutenant Voronov sent me for a group of cadets who were carried away by the pursuit of submachine gunners, and I ran down the lanes in the direction of the shots. In one place, I was fired upon from a machine gun. I dashed across the street and fell behind the house, and small pieces of wood, torn out by a burst of machine gun fire, spilled from its corner. I was already leading the guys back in the courtyards as the streets were shelled, and our cadets ran out of cartridges. Soon the Germans fired at our town and cemetery from mortars, then went on an assault to capture it. They could not use tanks there since the terrain was mountainous. Therefore, we repulsed the submachine gunners and even pursued them. Several cadets and the battalion Komsomol organizer, junior political instructor Maximov, who led the counterattack, died in the battle. There were also some wounded. Behind the Petkumak, near the ferry, we gathered 160 people. The commanders conferred about something, but then a passenger car of the head of the school, Colonel Sadovsky, drove up. We lined up as quick as a flash. The red banner of the school was taken out of the car, and against its background, the colonel gave the following order. The city is occupied by an enemy landing party. Its number is small, but it has several light tanks. Your task is to climb to the rear of the Germans in a roundabout way at nightfall and strike them from the side of Mashuk and Lermontov Petrov, cut off their retreat and break into the north. At the same time, from the south, from behind the Podkumak, the cadets of the 3rd Battalion will go on the offensive. They must seize the central avenue of the city. They will be supported by a border regiment of 300 bayonets and an artillery battery. The enemy is afraid of a night attack, and you know every street well. Therefore, you must act boldly and decisively. The city must be liberated till morning. It will be for you, graduates, an exam of loyalty to the motherland and future lieutenant ranks. Someone asked what those who did not have rifles had to do. We have no rifles. They must be obtained in a battle, was the answer. And we have brought you a few rounds of ammunition and grenades. They were distributed immediately. Only 40 years later did I learn from retired Colonel Kirillov that the head of the school was going to send us to the rear to Nalchik. But the commander of the cover zone, General Timofeyev, intervened. He allegedly reprimanded Colonel Sadovsky for leaving the upper town and ordered a night attack to knock the enemy out of the city. It was an adventurous decision. I think the General Timofeyev understood perfectly well that it was impossible to knock the Germans out of the city with such forces, with only rifles in hand. He also knew that there was no landing in the city, but by nightfall there was already a tank corps. But he had to prove to the high authorities that his troops fought to the last soldier and bullet. Having given the necessary orders, Colonel Sadovsky left. In the car, we noticed his son of our age, a woman, and a battalion commissar. They were accompanied by a truck with a dozen junior commanders armed with light machine guns. In the truck, being in charge, also left Lieutenant Voronov. Sadovsky appointed Senior Lieutenant Deineka, commander of the 14th Company. There were also 2 or 3 lieutenants from different companies. It was getting dark, and the detachment moved back. At that time, probably from Mashuk, or maybe an observer was hitting somewhere nearby. Then, with the flight artillery shells began to burst. We ran into the thickets. We crossed the river at dusk. The narrow flooring was wobbly, letting only one pass. We undressed and waited, lifting our clothes and weapons over our heads. Someone in the pits dived headlong, but in general, we crossed the river safely. Only Mikhail Levin had his legs spasmed, and he was left at the crossing to guard our knapsacks and rolls, with which it was inconvenient to go into battle. There, a group of commanders from our 4th Battalion finally approached us. Among them were the commander of the 15th Company, Senior Lieutenant Antoniuk, commander of our platoon, military technician of the 2nd rank Gava, commander of the 3rd platoon of our company, Senior Lieutenant Mordasov, substitute platoon commander, trainee technician, Lieutenant Nikitenko. We hadn't seen them all day. Where they had been, no one knew. We were just surprised. There were Germans in the city, but there were no commanders. It turned out that they were seeing their families off to the train to Nalchik, and we were commanded by other people's lieutenants and our sergeants. All commanders were brought in by the former tactics teacher, Captain Bykov, but not the same Captain Bykov who had been the commander of our 13th company. About a month before those events, he had been taken away from us into the active army, and Senior Lieutenant Dyagirev was appointed to us. But he left with part of the company, 1st and 4th platoons, to the Kuma line. Senior Lieutenant Mordashov was in charge of the rest of the company. A few words about Captain Bykov, a teacher. In August-September 1941, he was in the Consolidated Regiment as the commander of the 3rd Battalion and was injured. After recovering, he taught tactics again, and when the forward detachments of the zone of cover of the resort cities were formed, he became an adjutant to General Timofeyev, who sent him with a group of commanders to our detachment. Captain Bykov immediately announced that our detachment would be transformed into a consolidated battalion, of which he was appointed the commander. I must say that at that time there were already more than 200 of us. A platoon from Kislovodsk and several groups of cadets who were carrying our out garrison service in different places made their way to us. Bykov appointed Senior Lieutenant Mordashov as his substitute and military technician of the 2nd rank Gava as an executive officer. Company commanders remained. The 14th Daineka, the 15th Antoniuk, and our 13th half was received by Nikitenko. After a short halt and organizational clarifications, the battalion detachment moved towards Mashuk and the upper town. On the approach to them, the 15th company separated and went to comb the thickets at the foot of Mashuk with the ultimate goal of capturing the Lermontov Patrol. Then the 14th company went past Mashuk through the upper part of the cemetery in order to clear its zone of possible enemy firing points, noticed in the evening, and then, together with the 15th company, turned to the city and attacked the enemy on its outskirts. Our 13th company of 70 people quietly entered the town. It was empty. Coming out of it, we concentrated where we had held the defense during the day and began to wait for a signal for a general attack. It was about 12 at night. To the outskirts, where, according to intelligence, the rear guard of the landing was located, there was a 300-400 meter distance. Our commanders on the sidelines were conferring about something. And meanwhile, instead of lunch and dinner, we were satisfying our hunger with apples from the neighboring orchards. Nobody asked what condition our stomachs were in, but we had to go into battle. But then, accompanied by guards, Captain Bykov appeared. 30 people were selected from our company. Everyone was given a rifle and a cartridge pouch, as well as 2-3 grenades. Captain Bykov explained the objective. It was necessary to carry out a reconnaissance in force. We had to imperceptibly approach the houses behind which the farm of the former cavalry school was located. There were stacks of straw and hay, allegedly taken at gunpoint by the artillery battery of the 26th Frontier Regiment. If we managed to catch on to the outermost houses, then at the signal of 2 red missiles, the artillery battery would hit the stacks and the 14th and 15th companies would go to our aid. Our second platoon was the most complete, so we all ended up in the attacking squad, which was led by the technician Lieutenant Nikitenko, and Sergeant Levchenko became his deputy. At about 12 at night, we set out on a mission. The night was quiet and moonlit. Only the tracer bullets traced their fiery trails in the air almost continuously. The Germans either frightened us off or calmed themselves by shooting. We walked in silence and quickly, tense, ready to rush into hand-to-hand combat at any moment. We had mastered personal weapons, bayonets, and butts like a wolf with the teeth. In the dark, this could give us some advantage when approaching the enemy. We walked past the cemetery into the open space. It was necessary to overcome those last meters quickly and imperceptibly. Bending down, we went almost at a run and were noticed at the very outskirts, 70 meters from the enemy forward posts. Flares flashed, automatic rounds hit, and at the same moment, Lieutenant Nikitenko shouted, "Forward, beat the fascists." With shouts of hooray, we rushed forward, firing rifles on the run. From the first position that the Germans occupied in the natural hollow, we knocked them out. The Fritzes, dumbfounded by the sudden blow, firing back, left for the houses. It could be seen how the points were moving away with interruptions, from which tracing bullets rushed towards us like wasps. But we also had to lie down in the captured hollow, since the oncoming automatic fire seemed to us rather dense, and we had the first killed and wounded. It turned out as if it was a forced respite. An unimaginable clamor rose in the enemy's camp, shouts, commands, screams of the wounded. And Nikitenko commanded at the top of his voice, "The first platoon on the left, the second on the right, surround," although there were no platoons. And the promised artillery support did not follow from the Podkumok. But the battle from Mashuk began to be heard louder. That 14th company, seeing the red missiles and hearing the echoes of our battle, launched an attack on the enemy, firing points in its own zone. We tried to cover the horse farm from the flanks. However, the Germans, sensing the danger, set fire to a stack of straw that stood in the courtyard. The flame shot up to the sky. The entire outskirts of the city seemed to be on fire. That worked in enemy's favor, since they were protected by houses, and our side groups were illuminated in open terrain and were forced, suffering losses, to retreat to the saving hollow. While in the left flank group, I was seriously wounded at that time. It happened like this. I was not abandoned by the thought of getting a German machine gun in battle, as the head of the school had advised. I crawled to the enemy firing point and threw 2 grenades at it. The fire stopped and I began to creep closer, and then another submachine gunner noticed me and fired a burst. I crawled along a small groove to the bump and hid behind it. But it was so small that you hid your head, you could see your ass, and you pulled it up, your head stuck out. At that time, the ill-fated stack set on fire. It became clear as in the palm of your hand. There was about 10 meters left to the hollow, and I, having gathered together all my muscular forces, rushed to it and jumped straight headfirst. And already at the last moment, when only one leg flashed over the edge, an explosive bullet hit the right ankle and shattered the heel bone. It was as if the calcaneus had been hit hard with a hammer. At first, the whole body suddenly felt numb, and then severe pain began. The comrades cut the boot leg and took off the boot, bandaged the wound, and also pulled in the leg tight above the knee with a belt. Then they carried me along a hollow into some kind of ravine from rain and sewage. There I moaned and bit my lips till blood. The battle after the arson of the stag continued not in our favor, and no help came. It was evident from everything that reinforcements had approached the Germans. They had a mortar and bombs swelled in our position, and then artillery shells. Exploding, they lifted a mass of earth into the air, along with fragments and stones. All this fell on our heads. In the midst of the battle, the voice of Cadet Alexander Desluk was suddenly heard. "Comrade Lieutenant, can I sing?" Permission followed, and, as if competing with the whistle of bombs and shells, the song sounded. There's light in my heart from a cheerful song. It never lets me get bored. And they love this song in hamlets and villages, and they love this song in big cities. Sasha, our dear Sasha, the platoon favorite, inexhaustible Terkin. He was originally from the Dnipropetrovsk region. Before the war, he had graduated from a railway technical school and worked as a duty officer at the Kuybyshev station. He had an exemption from military service, but the time was troubling and he decided to become a military man. Fate gave him to our company. He was 21 years old, the smallest among us in height and the most accurate at the word. He was simply inexhaustible in terms of inventions and jokes. He knew a lot of ditties and parodies of Hitler and Goebbels, of Hans and Fritz, and sent them with a unique humor, adding strong words from himself on the go. Sometimes, tired and hungry, we would sit down during tactical exercises at a hall. Suddenly someone would say, "Sasha, figure something out." And he pondered and we laughed, driving away fatigue. And then, at the critical moment with his song, he seemed to remind us of what was dear and close to us, as well as of our harsh soldier's duty. Following the lyric song, Sasha switched to his favorite parodies. To the popular then song Blue Handkerchief, he sang, "Dirty soldier's handkerchief, hand sends home," and adds a few lines saying things are ow. We go, we run through the open spaces of others. The pilot is spinning, the machine gunner beats. Say goodbye to your husband. The Germans intensified the fire, and he sang. And he fell silent only when he said the last thing in his life, "I am wounded," as if he apologized that he could no longer sing. The wound was fatal. The further dragging out of the battle turned more and more clearly against us. The cartridges were running out. The number of killed and wounded increased, but the opposite side also had them. Sometimes such screams came from there, as if the Fritz had been slaughtered alive. We, biting our lips to blood, restrained ourselves so that the enemy could not know our losses. The step was burning out, but dawn broke. Shooting near Mashuk stopped, and no help came. It was as if they had forgotten about us. Then Lieutenant Nikitenko took a gamble, a desperate attack. His calculation was as follows. If in front of us there was really a rear guard of the landing, then it was also not without losses. And if we managed to overcome 50-60 meters with one throw and reach the houses, then at least some part of the cadets under their cover would be able to break away from the enemy and live along the outskirts of the city to the cemetery and Mashuk. Or maybe win with the bayonet and a grenade. But it was impossible to retreat back through the open area. We had moved too far. so far away that neither could we go nor help could come. We began to prepare for the attack. The wounded handed over their cartridges to those who went to the breakthrough. Their fate depended on success or failure. By that time, I had left my dangerous ravine where the heightened S was falling more and more often. It was too uncomfortable and burdensome for me, lying in it alone, like an earthen coffin, the lid of which was about to be slammed by another bomb. All around it was torn, hissing like in hell. The pungent fumes teased the nose and throat, and sometimes there was not enough air to breathe. Only later, from the testimony of the prisoners, it turned out that the German Chemical Division had been fighting in Pyatigorsk. It crushed us with bombs stuffed with chemicals. I, the wounded man, was terribly thirsty, and along the bottom of the hollow, in some places, there was dirty but still water. The pain in the leg was severe, but not the same as in the beginning, and I, crossing my legs, crawled on my hands from my gully down along the hollow. At first, I overcame 8 meters, then 5, 3, 1, and suddenly I felt that I had no strength for more. I had bled out and weakened. At that time, something banged and struck between the shoulder blades so that I felt sick. I began to lose consciousness. I opened my eyes and saw the stars, and closed them I dreamt of pulsating spring water, which I could not reach. But the sonorous voice of Lieutenant Nikitenko I seemed to hear well. For the motherland, for Stalin, hooray! However, I could no longer help my comrades in arms, who rose for the last time to win or lay down their heads. A continuous barrage of oncoming fire cut lives short at dawn on August the 10th, 1942. Here are the names of those who are still in my memory. Andrei Antonovich Nikitenko, technician, lieutenant, detachment commander, a native of Donetsk region. Leonid Levchenko, sergeant, commander of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company, deputy detachment commander. Bilogai, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Ivan Hushim, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company, originally from the Penza region. Vasily Yerin, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Yeliseyev, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Zharikov, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Nikolai Zhuravlev, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Samuil Kalinkovich, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company, originally from Poltava. Arnold Kirnos, cadet of the 2nd platoon, Komsomol organizer of the 13th company, originally from Poltava. Lukyanchenko, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Marchenko, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Yuri Primak, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Alexander Ryabchenko, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Alexander Teslyuk, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Nikolai Tkachuk, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. Nikolai Shevchenko, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company, from Penza. Astafyev, cadet of the 2nd platoon of the 13th company. There were altogether 25 cadets from our platoon and 4 volunteers from the 3rd platoon. Maybe some of them survived, like me, but I could not find anyone.